Life has a way of testing us in unimaginable ways. For Daniel Carter, a 38-year-old history professor, the greatest challenges came from losing the two most important women in his life, first his mother when he was just 10, and years later, his wife Annie to a relentless illness. But amidst the heartbreak, Daniel found the strength to rebuild, guided by love for his children and the memories of those he lost. This is his story of resilience, loss, and healing. The smell of pancakes filled the quiet kitchen, a silent comfort that Daniel Carter clung to on mornings like this. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as he poured batter into the pan and listened to the faint sizzle. Ella, his 10-year-old daughter, sat at the table, her head bent over a sketch pad. Her pencil moved in short, quick strokes, but the occasional pause gave her away she was distracted, just like him. Liam, his 7-year-old son, burst into the room chasing their dog, his laughter momentarily breaking the stillness. But Daniel saw the fleeting sadness in his eyes when he caught sight of the photograph on the counter, Annie's favorite family portrait. Next to it was a much older photo of a young woman holding a smiling boy, Daniel, and his mother, Marianne. It had been a year since Annie passed, but some days it felt like yesterday. Today, especially, the weight of her absence was palpable. "Daddy, can we visit Mom's garden later?" Ella asked softly, her voice pulling Daniel from his thoughts. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He didn't want to show it, but grief was a relentless companion, sneaking up on him in moments like these. Even as he tried to focus on the kids, on being their anchor, he felt adrift himself. But Daniel had promised himself that today would be about honoring Annie, not mourning her. With a small smile, he served the pancakes, knowing that the memories they kept alive would carry them forward, even on the hardest days. Daniel was just 10 years old when he learned that love could be ripped away in an instant. It had been an ordinary rainy evening when the knock came at the door. He remembered his father's face going pale as he opened it to a uniformed police officer who delivered the words that would change their lives forever. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry to inform you, your wife didn't survive the accident." Marianne Carter had been Daniel's everything, his source of bedtime stories, his cheerleader at soccer games, his safe place when the world felt too big. But in that moment she was gone, and nothing made sense anymore. His father, a man of few words, tried to stay strong for Daniel, but even at 10, Daniel could see the cracks. The days that followed were a blur of condolences and casseroles, none of which filled the gaping hole Marianne had left behind. At night, Daniel would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, hoping that if he wished hard enough, she'd come back. But life doesn't work that way. That loss shaped Daniel in ways he didn't fully understand until much later. It made him cautious, wary of getting too close to people. After all, love could vanish in the blink of an eye. It was a lesson he carried with him into adulthood, one that would both challenge and strengthen him when he faced loss again. Years later, Daniel met Annie, and for the first time in a long while, life began to feel warm again. It was a crisp autumn evening at a university fundraiser, where Daniel had reluctantly agreed to speak about the importance of preserving local history. He wasn't in the mood for small talk or socializing, but then he saw her. Annie was volunteering at the event, arranging the seating chart with a look of intense concentration. She had a smile that seemed to brighten the entire room and a way of moving that exuded both purpose and ease. When their eyes met, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. She approached him later that night, thanking him for his insightful speech. "History professor, huh? Does that mean you're a storyteller too?" she teased, her voice light but curious. They struck up a conversation, one that flowed so naturally it was as if they had known each other forever. In the weeks that followed, Daniel found himself drawn to her compassion and joy for life. Annie, a pediatric nurse, carried a kind of optimism that was contagious. She had a way of seeing the beauty in the smallest things, a skill that challenged Daniel's guarded nature. One evening, during a walk through the park, Daniel opened up about losing his mother. He expected pity, but Annie surprised him. "Loss doesn't make you weaker, Daniel. It gives you a depth most people don't understand. You've already endured more than most. Don't let fear stop you from living." It was that moment Daniel realized she wasn't just someone he liked, she was someone he needed. Ella's birth was a defining moment for Daniel. He had been nervous, pacing the hospital room as Annie reassured him with her usual calm. When Ella finally arrived, Daniel was overwhelmed by an emotion he couldn't fully describe, an overwhelming love mixed with the daunting responsibility of being a father. 2 years later, Liam was born, and their little family felt complete. Life with young children was a whirlwind, but it was a beautiful one. Their home was filled with the sounds of laughter, playful arguments, and Annie's soothing voice as she read bedtime stories. Annie, ever the nurturer, loved creating traditions. Every Friday night was family storytelling night where they'd take turns making up elaborate adventures. Ella's stories were filled with fairies and magic, while Liam's often revolved around superheroes saving the day. Daniel cherished these nights, not just for the joy they brought but for the sense of unity they created. Their annual picnics were another cherished ritual. Annie loved planning them, packing everyone's favorite foods and taking family photos under the same big oak tree at the park. One year, as they sat under the tree, Ella asked, "Mom, will we always do this?" Annie smiled and replied, "As long as we have each other, we will." Daniel never forgot those words. They were a promise he wanted to keep, even when life would later test him in unimaginable ways. For now, though, he was content. Life felt full, and for the first time in years, Daniel believed happiness could last. It started with exhaustion that Annie couldn't shake. She brushed it off as overwork, long shifts at the hospital, and late nights with the kids. But when the fatigue turned into persistent pain, Daniel insisted she see a doctor. He remembered the day vividly, sitting in the sterile office, holding Annie's hand as they waited for the test results. The doctor's expression was grave, his words deliberate. "Annie, the scans show it's stage 4. The cancer has spread significantly." The words felt like a punch to Daniel's chest. He stared at the doctor, hoping he'd misunderstood, but Annie's silence confirmed the unthinkable. She squeezed his hand tightly, her voice steady but soft. "How much time?" "Months," the doctor said gently. "We'll do everything we can to keep you comfortable." On the car ride home, Daniel struggled to find the right words, but Annie broke the silence. "We're not going to waste the time we have left," she said firmly, her voice filled with the quiet strength he'd always admired. Annie faced her illness with remarkable grace. She continued to care for Ella and Liam, even when chemotherapy left her too weak to stand for long. She started recording videos for the kids, filled with advice and messages of love for moments she knew she wouldn't be there to witness. Watching her fight, Daniel felt both admiration and devastation. He wanted to believe there was hope, but every trip to the hospital was a reminder of how little time they had. He began to notice the parallels between this experience and the loss of his mother. It was like living the same nightmare twice, only this time he was the one left behind to guide his children through it. As Annie's condition worsened, Daniel found himself haunted by memories of losing his mother. He'd been Ella's age when Marianne died in that car accident. Now, he saw the same confusion and fear in Ella's eyes that he'd once felt. One night, after tucking the kids into bed, Daniel sat alone in the living room, staring at the photograph of his mother that Annie had placed on the mantel years ago. He couldn't help but draw comparisons between the two women, both so full of life, both taken too soon. Grief felt like an old, unwelcome companion, returning to his life uninvited. Daniel remembered how his father had struggled to hold things together after Marianne's death, and he wondered if he could do the same for Ella and Liam. Could he shield them from the full weight of loss, or was that impossible? Ella began asking questions that mirrored the ones Daniel had asked as a child. "Why is this happening to Mom? Can't the doctors fix her?" Liam, too young to fully grasp the situation, often asked, "Will Mom be better tomorrow?" Daniel tried his best to answer them, but there were no words that could make it easier. Despite the pain, Daniel found solace in one thing: Annie's resilience. She never allowed the illness to define her. "We're still a family," she'd say, "and we'll always be a family, no matter what happens." Annie's unwavering love and determination to create lasting memories inspired Daniel to face his fears head-on. He realized that while grief was inevitable, it didn't have to consume him or his children. He vowed to honor both Annie and his mother by teaching Ella and Liam that love, even in the face of loss, was something that could never be taken away. The house felt quieter in those final days, as if even time itself was holding its breath. Annie's energy had dwindled, and the bedroom became her sanctuary. Daniel moved a comfortable chair to her bedside, spending hours holding her hand and whispering reassurances he hoped she could believe. Ella and Liam would climb into bed with her, their voices soft as they read her their favorite stories, roles reversed now. Annie had always been the glue that held their family together, and even as her strength faded, she continued to guide them. She called Daniel close one evening, her voice barely a whisper. "Promise me, Daniel, you'll keep the traditions alive. The Friday stories, the picnics, everything, they'll need those pieces of us." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "I promise," he said, though the weight of her request pressed heavily on his chest. Annie's final night was filled with a kind of bittersweet peace. Ella and Liam had fallen asleep beside her, their small hands clutching hers. Daniel stayed awake, watching the rise and fall of her breath. In the early hours, she opened her eyes and gave him one last, faint smile. "You'll be okay," she said softly, her gaze filled with love and certainty. "You all will." When her breathing stopped, the silence was deafening. Daniel felt like the world had shifted, leaving him untethered. But as he held her one final time, he remembered her words were still a family. Even in his grief, he knew she was right. The days after Annie's passing were a blur of condolences and logistical tasks. Funeral arrangements, legal paperwork, and endless casseroles from well-meaning neighbors filled Daniel's time, but nothing filled the void she had left. Ella and Liam reacted to the loss in their own ways. Ella became quieter, often retreating into her sketchpad. Liam, on the other hand, became more energetic, almost as if he were trying to outrun his sadness. Daniel found himself juggling his own grief while trying to understand theirs. One evening, Ella approached him with her sketchpad. "I drew Mom," she said, showing him a picture of Annie in her garden, surrounded by flowers. "Do you think she'd like it?" Daniel's throat tightened. "She'd love it, Ella. She'd be so proud of you." Slowly, he began to find ways to keep Annie's spirit alive in their everyday lives. They continued the Friday storytelling nights, though now Daniel often struggled to find the right words. The annual picnic under the oak tree became a memorial event, with the three of them sharing memories of Annie. In his quiet moments, Daniel reflected on his promise to Annie. He realized that while the pain of losing her would never fully go away, it didn't have to define their lives. He focused on teaching Ella and Liam the values Annie had instilled in them: kindness, resilience, and the importance of cherishing every moment. As the months passed, Daniel began to see glimpses of healing not just in his children, but in himself. Ella's laughter grew more frequent, and Liam started sleeping through the night again. And though their family looked different now, they remained a family, bound by the love Annie had cultivated. Daniel knew he wasn't just navigating life without Annie, he was carrying her with him in every choice he made, every tradition he upheld, and every story he told. The anniversary of Annie's death loomed over Daniel like a dark cloud. It had been 6 months since she passed, but the pain felt as fresh as the first day. He had prepared himself for the day, but nothing could truly prepare him for the quiet weight of absence that would fill their home. He woke up early, the same way he had when Annie was alive, making pancakes for the kids, though this time it felt different, as if the house itself was mourning along with him. Ella and Liam knew what the day meant. They had always been close to their mother, and now, without her, they had to learn to navigate their own grief. Ella was unusually quiet, sitting at the table with her arms wrapped around a small plush bear that had once belonged to Annie. Liam, who had always been more outgoing, now hesitated at every turn, unsure of how to fill the silence. At lunch, Daniel took them to the park, the spot where they had always had their picnics. The old oak tree stood strong, but there was something different about it now, something that felt both comforting and heartbreaking. Underneath its sprawling branches, Daniel laid out a blanket, and the three of them sat together in silence, remembering Annie. "I miss Mom," Liam said softly, his voice breaking through the quiet. "I want her to come back." Daniel's heart shattered as he looked at his son, unsure of what to say. "I miss her too, buddy," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But she's always with us in everything we do." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the park, reminiscing, telling stories of Annie, and sharing their favorite memories of her. Daniel realized that although the pain of losing her would never fully go away, honoring her legacy through the things she loved, through the little rituals they kept alive, was a way to carry her with them every day. As the months passed, Daniel slowly began to understand that grief wasn't something to be defeated, it was something to live with. It didn't go away, but it became a part of him, woven into the fabric of his life. There were still days when the weight of Annie's absence was unbearable, but there were also moments of peace. Ella and Liam had adjusted to life without their mother, and though they still had their difficult days, they were healing. They had learned to lean on each other, and Daniel had learned to let them. He had spent so many years trying to shield them from pain, but now he saw that grief could be shared. They didn't need to face it alone. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Liam spoke up. "Dad, can we still do the storytelling night? Like the way we used to with Mom?" Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of sadness and pride. "Of course, buddy. We'll keep doing it just like Mom would have wanted." That night, they gathered in the living room, and Ella took the lead with a story of their own making, something about a dragon who found a family of its own. The laughter that filled the room was bittersweet, but it was real, and it was theirs. Daniel knew there was no getting over Annie. He would always carry her memory with him. But he also realized that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about embracing the future, no matter how uncertain it seemed. It was about keeping the traditions she loved alive and finding new ways to honor her every day. In the end, Daniel discovered that life wasn't about waiting for grief to disappear. It was about moving forward with the love and strength that had always been there, even in the hardest of times. He was no longer alone in this journey. He had Ella and Liam, and together, they would continue to live their lives in a way that honored the woman who had made them who they were. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more content. Your support means everything to me.